Hey guys, it's Cam from Craft and Tailored, and in this episode of What Is On My Wrist, we are talking about a 1970s Zenith A386, which is a pretty famous chronograph as it was the introduction of the Zenith El Primero movement, which is the first automatic or self-winding chronograph movement. So let's get into the details. So the Zenith El Primero reference A386 is unlike any other chronograph when it was both aesthetically and mechanically first available on January 10th in 1969. What's interesting about the year 1969 is we had a lot of things happening in 69. We went to the moon in 1969, and we also had this thing called the chronograph race, if you will. So we had a space race and we also had a chronograph race. So what's really cool about this period in time is up until 1969, all chronograph movements were mechanically wound. So that means that you had to wind them. You can see Cousteau there, he's making his debut cameo appearance here, chilling in the back, not facing the camera. But in any case, what's cool about this is, back in this time period, sports watches were really used for their intended purpose. Timing lap times, timing, distances, calculating speeds, fuel consumption, all that kind of stuff. So these watches were really a technical piece of kit and not just a luxury item at this point. So let's talk a little bit about kind of this race to create the world's first chronograph and talk about some of the players that were involved and ultimately what led to the Zenith El Primero movement. And one of the things that's really cool about this is Zenith movements are a movement that really kind of set the standard for what was going to be an automatic or self-winding chronograph movement. Matter of fact, Rolex implemented them into their first automatic chronographs, or Daytonas rather, and that is ultimately why you hear the nickname Zenith Daytona. The Zenith Daytona was actually a base caliber Zenith El Primero movement. So really interesting history there, and we'll get into that in a minute. In 69, the Zenith El Primero 30169 PHC beat out Seiko and the Chronomatic group. The Chronomatic group consisted of Breitling, Heuer, Hamilton, Büren, and they basically worked together to create an automatic or self-winding chronograph movement. So what was really interesting is that Zenith was kind of its own, independent brand that was technically working to make a automatic chronograph, but yet you had the Chronomatic group teaming up and kind of working together, combining their technical watchmakers to create a self-winding movement. But let's talk about the Zenith for a quick second. The Calibre 3019 PHC was kind of showcased initially in the A386. What's interesting about the Zenith movement is that it's a 3-register chronograph versus a 2-register, which you'll see in a lot of the chronomatic movements. Like for example, the movement that you'll see in like the Monacos or the chronomatic GMTs from Hamilton and that kind of stuff. And the other thing that I think is kind of nifty about this is that it also includes a date complication. I think that for 1969 was a pretty cool advancement and cool feature to include in the watch. What makes the A386 and other Zenith El Primero based chronographs true legends and ultimately icons is to think about the many watches outside of just the Zenith brand that feature the A386 base caliber of movement. And as we were talking before, the first self-winding Rolex Daytona featured a base caliber Zenith El Primero movement, which is really cool. It wasn't until the year 2000 that Rolex really went to their own in-house caliber self-winding movement. Up until that point, the 4-digit Daytonas relied on Valjoux, base caliber movements, and they were all self-winding. So let's talk a little bit about the A386, and I want to kind of do some tech specs and just talk about why I really like this watch. One interesting thing too is that the watch is a self-winding chronograph movement, but it's also really not that thick. And what's kind of cool about that is if you look at some of the other automatic or self-winding, chronograph movements, you almost have like this modular, like bolt-on oscillating weight that makes the watches in many cases very thick. And you'll see that within Heuer, you'll see that in kind of the Chronomatic group watches, they're kind of thick even though those movements were based around micro rotor technology. And we also have some videos that I'll link up here and down below that kind of talk about those watches, including the Heuer Monaco and some other watches that leverage movements that leverage the micro rotor and all that kind of stuff. Let me say leverage one more time. Leverage. in any case, the thing from a design and kind of ergonomic perspective that's cool about this watch is that it's really thin, and it really wasn't until later that the other watch manufacturers kind of caught up to that, you know, non-modular technology and could create something that was, you know, thin like this. And there's a really good resource. If you go to alphahands.com, they did an amazing job of kind of documenting all the mark variants, all of the history, all of the hands, like all this amazing stuff. And it's a resource that I use when authenticating and ultimately looking at different Zenith A386s. Matter of fact, we haven't had a lot of Zenith A386s. I think in my possession I've only had maybe 2 or 3. This is the first one that's really even made it to the website. But I think that the 386 as a reference as a whole is definitely an icon in its own right. And the other thing too that makes it a really interesting watch is that it really was the first automatic self-winding chronograph, and it's kind of an icon in its own right. So one really unique feature about the piece is that it has these 3 contrasting subdials. And what's unique about the subdials is that they actually overlap each other, which creates a nice depth and dimension to the watch. The other thing to note is that there's a lot of care and a lot of design input that was put into the dial of the watch. It wasn't something that was kind of haphazardly slapped together, and I think Zenith back in that era really recognized that that was of importance, especially considering that it was the first, you know, commercially marketed and available automatic chronograph. So, you know, one little interesting note here is that the 6 o'clock subdial is kind of tucked in between the 3 and the 9 o'clock, but it's underneath those 2 subdials if you actually look at it, and the chronograph or the recorder hand is actually smaller in there because of the way that it's tucked in against the 2 subdials. So there's a lot of like thought and insight into the design and kind of ultimate execution of the way that this was put together. This specific example is really nice. This one has a Mark III case, which remains in really, really good condition. If you look at the finishing details and characteristics, it's so thoughtful. Obviously, there was an era or time and place where these watches just kind of weren't valued. Watches are over-polished, abused, or taken apart, et cetera, et cetera. The watches will lose features, finishing characteristics, lug profiles, crowns, pushers, bracelets, all that kind of stuff, hand dials. This one is in really good original condition. The dial has kind of taken on this warm patina. The subdials are in really good condition. There is some wear and use with the watch, but overall it's a really nice example. This is specifically a Mark III case, and the other really cool thing is this watch actually retains its original Gayfarer's ladder bracelet, which is kind of a unique bracelet. Matter of fact, Zenith today is producing El Primero based chronographs or watches that are marketed under the El Primero history, and I think that they're doing a really good job of kind of modernizing the pieces, but ultimately kind of retaining some of the brand heritage. And a lot of their watches actually feature this ladder bracelet, which I think is kind of a love it or hate it. For me personally, it's definitely a unique bracelet and one that is pretty hard to find. Unique too that it is a flip lock style bracelet, not just kind of like a pressure fit bracelet. And then the other unique thing about the bracelet too is it does include, you know, this kind of Rolex-esque diver's extension. So what's interesting is that it's kind of like a Submariner style bracelet with a, you know, diver's extension, and yet this is a chronograph, not something that you would probably strap over a wetsuit and go scuba diving with. So in any case, the dial is in really, really good condition. It's got that tri subdial. So we've got the blue, the gray, and the silver subdials, which you'll only see in the A386 within this era and within the El Primero movement range, which is really cool. It's a pump pusher chronograph, which I really like. The watch diameter is 38 millimeters, so it's kind of the same size as like a you know, like a Daytona, like a 6263 or 6265. Overall, it doesn't wear small, it doesn't wear large. I think it's kind of in the sweet spot for overall size. On wrist, it wears really nicely, even on the bracelet. I really have enjoyed wearing the watch. And the one thing that I really like is kind of the execution of the hands. We have this red, you know, sweep seconds hand, which is visibly eye-catching. There's a nice, distinct kind of black enameled tip to the minute and the hour hands. And overall, it's just a really nice watch on wrist. I think that, you know, has a nice presence. But one cool thing that Zenith, I think, is still doing is they are offering an extract service, and they are still servicing these watches for the most part, based on my knowledge and you know, working with Zenith. So that's kind of a cool feature too. From a value perspective, have definitely increased in the past 3 to 5 years. People are definitely starting to pay attention to them. And then also, due to websites like Alpha Hands and others out there, there's an abundance of information about the mark variants and all that kind of stuff. So these watches are collectible from that perspective, but I would say that they are going to become increasingly more collectible due to people realizing the history and kind of the importance of these watches. So in any case, guys, thanks for tuning in. If you haven't done so already, help us out, hit the subscribe button. If you've got watch questions, we're here and happy to help. Drop us a line at info@craftandtailored.com. If you're not following us already on Instagram, we're at craftandtailored. And thanks for tuning in, guys. I'll provide a link in the description below so that you can check this out, and we'll see you in the next one. I think it's good to every once in a while give a watch a good charge on the mainspring.